Yes, it's odd, isn't it, that we happen to be stuck with this gospel passage of gloom and doom for our 50th anniversary. That was a valiant effort in helping us hear the hope. But then again, many of us have had a particularly gloomy, even doomy week. Will our nation, our church, our community, we as individuals be part of the problem or part of the solution when it comes to global warming and global warring, poverty and unemployment, racism and sexism, Islamophobia and homophobia, the taking of life and the taking of hope? And what about midterms and finals? Graduate school applications and job searches, broken hearts and shattered dreams. In Newman the Musical, as well as in Newman the Musical the movie, and in Newman the Musical the movie, the sing-along version, Francisca finds that she's the only one who has shown up to help Rosie and David set up for the 50th anniversary celebration. Even worse, she notices that the theme, which is set forth on a big banner, is proclaim a year of gloom. And before you can say there's no place like the Newman Center Catholic community at UCSD, Francisca is whisked away by God from this bizarre alternate reality and set down in the 1960s, where she finds Father Ernie and Teresa Cooper setting up for Mass on the beach in a sea of tie-dye. During the odyssey that follows, Francisca becomes the sometimes unwitting vehicle of God's grace as she stops in a moment in time during each decade our community has existed, helping the Newman community make the choices that have brought us to this place of celebration today. Choices like welcoming and reaching out, doing justice, building bridges, seeking truth, forming leaders, sharing belief, cultivating faith, building community, embracing diversity, celebrating the sacraments, serving with compassion, and responding to God's call. You've had a year to memorize those. I'll quiz you after. I don't have them memorized either. But the mnemonic device, of course, is our song, Upside Inside Out, Living La Vida Loca. While there isn't really, not living the Newman, what is it? Living La Vida Newman, that's it. While there isn't really a Francisca, each of us has made loving choices along the way that have brought us to this day. And that's what we've been celebrating all year. 50 years of God's grace and 50 years of this community and its members cooperating with God's grace. But we've also been looking to the present and looking ahead. Proclaim a year of favor is our gospel theme for the year. Jesus unrolled the scroll and found the passage where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring glad tidings to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim a year of the Lord's favor." Jesus is boldly calling for a celebration of the 50-year Jubilee, a traditional call to set slaves free and to return land and property to the original owners and to forgive debts. In other words, Jesus is calling for justice and mercy. And so we have tried to be faithful to the Jubilee call this year, trying to act on those 12 Newman values that Francisca discovers and that have evolved and developed here over the years. And now at the end of our Jubilee year, we are looking ahead to the next 50 years. At the Jubilee dinner last night, the Father Ernie Mort 50-Year Fund was introduced as a bold sign of hope for our continued growth for the next 50 years. As an exercise in boldly dreaming, members of our extended staff during our spring planning meeting days took turns expressing possible news headlines for our 100th anniversary. Newman UCSD's 50th annual Peace Conference draws record crowds. The bridge between Rome and Canterbury has been built in San Diego. Newman to host Papal Visit 2066 on the 53rd anniversary of Pope Francis's years as Pope. Newman breaks ground for its Pastoral Center for Student and Young Adult Development. Newman expands housing to 500 students. Associated Students' Muslim president receives Newman's prestigious Thomas Aquinas Award at Commencement 2066. When you let yourself dream boldly for our community and its mission to UCSD over the next 50 years, what would your bold headlines be? Let that be our homework. But isn't it presumptuous to plan ahead when today's gospel makes it clear that all of this will end someday? That great and terrible a day that could come at any time? I better speak fast. How can we proclaim 50 more years of favor when today Jesus proclaims an imminent day of judgment? Yet what better way to prepare for that day whenever it comes than to persevere in proclaiming God's love? Why let fear of God's judgment, or more likely fear of the judgment of others, persecution even, why let fear keep us from Jubilee lives and from sharing that Jubilee life generously and boldly with others? And if it's Jesus' judgment we fear, surely we don't want to face him without having acted in hope. Jesus says, do not be afraid. And that's our theme for the new liturgical year starting in 2 weeks, a theme which comes from the New Year's Gospel, Matthew. Now, when the disciples saw Jesus walking on the sea, they were terrified. It is a ghost, they said, and they cried out in fear. At once Jesus spoke to them, take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid. Peter said to him in reply, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. He said, come. Peter got out of the boat and began to walk on the water toward Jesus. But when he saw how strong the wind was, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. Immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? After they got into the boat, the wind died down. Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid. Come, walk across the water. Even in today's gospel passage, Jesus tells us not to be afraid. When you hear of wars and insurrections, do not be terrified, for such things must happen first, but it will not immediately end. The passage can get a little convoluted about what does and doesn't signify an imminent end, but that's part of the point. We're not supposed to get caught up in speculating on when the end is. We're not supposed to be busybodies, as St. Paul tells the Thessalonians and Lahoyans today. We can be busy, can't we, about speculation, fear, blame and what have you, but we're called, rather, to be busy proclaiming another year of favor, acting out those Newman values and trusting that God is with us each step of the way. We don't meekly shuffle along in darkness. We march in the light of God, boldly walking on the waters of hope and life. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Do not be, you can stand if you want. Do not be afraid. 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 To welcome and reach out. Do not be afraid. To seek truth and do justice. Do not be afraid. To cultivate our faith. Do not be afraid. To share our belief. Do not be afraid. Embrace diversity. Do not be afraid. To celebrate the sacraments. Do not be afraid. To build up community. Do not be afraid. Form leaders. Build bridges. Do not be afraid. To serve with compassion. Do not be afraid. Respond to God's call. Do not be afraid. Take courage. Do not be afraid. Be stout-hearted. Do not be afraid. Walk boldly. Walk on the waters. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid.